Cześć, hello, witam, and welcome to Pierogi to Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matalevich. The recent events surrounding the death of Pope Francis and the election of Pope Leo XIV meant that for several weeks in late April and early May, the eyes of the world were focused on central Italy to the legendary Vatican City. In moments of such international spotlight, people around the world tend to rediscover the marvel and beauty of the Roman Catholic Church in its pageantry and history that are on full display. Sitting at the center of these broadcasted images of the Eternal City is, of course, the iconic St. Peter's Basilica, the largest church in the world. Contained within its centuries-old walls are masterpieces of art and architecture by Renaissance masters such as Bernini and Raphael. But soaring above it all is the magnificent dome designed by none other than Michelangelo himself. Amidst this breathtaking sensory overload, the viewer's eyes may chance to fall on a Latin quote inscribed along the inside of this dome in giant ornamental lettering. It reads, Tu es Petrus, et super anc Petram edificabo ecclesiam meam. Or in English, You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. This quote lies at the heart of St. Peter's very significance. For in its literal and figurative sense, the church building and all it represents is built directly atop Peter's tomb, the very rock himself, who, according to the Gospels, was the apostle commissioned by Jesus with building his church on earth. Yet Peter's tomb does not sit in isolation, as the entire campus covers an ancient Roman cemetery containing thousands of tombs, many of early Christian martyrs and its earliest popes, most of whom were often one and the same. In the first century, Christians began saying Mass above the tombs of these martyrs, seeking to gain their intercession as well as a connection with those who were recognized for their holiness. This ancient practice is one that extends not just to today in Rome, but in churches around the world, including to our apostolate center of St. Joseph's here in Camden. The main attraction for visitors to our apostolate church is a collection of first-class relics that are prominently displayed on the altar rail. While most people understand the origins, use, and practice of saints' relics in churches, the visitor to St. Joseph's likely does not know the origin story of our particular collection. The fascinating tale behind them is what brings us to our guest today, and it is a story which walks hand in hand with an identity that is so much a part of our community. Tony Barolin is the nephew of another Tony, Father Anthony Cecich, a Croatian priest and refugee of the Second World War, who made his home in Camden after immigrating to the United States. It was Father Cecich who amassed this wonderful collection of relics that so many visitors marvel at today. My interview with Tony revealed the heritage of this collection in a wonderful detail, as well as giving yet another glimpse into a portrait of Camden from yesteryear. It was a wonderful discussion of faith, family, international, and local history that I hope will delight you as much as it did me. So, Tony, thank you so very much for being on Pierogi to Prayer. Really delighted to have this conversation with you today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So we'll just start out by telling a little bit about yourself, maybe just kind of basic facts and where you're from.
Well, I live right now in Sewell, New Jersey, in Washington Township. But originally, we are from Camden. After World War II, my parents immigrated to the United States, and St. Joseph's Church and the Camden Parish was where we settled. I lived a few blocks from the church, right next to West Jersey Hospital. I went to the grammar school. And then like 25 years later, my parents, like everyone else in Camden, moved to West Collingswood Heights or Collingswood and moved out of the city. And I think that's now reversing itself. I was in the advertising business for 40 years. I have 3 children, been married 40 years. In fact, we're planning to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary and head to Croatia. Now that I've had an opportunity to be invited to this podcast, I've been talking with my brother, and we've had some really nice memories about the times we spent at St. Joe's and the Polish heritage and some of the things we did when we lived in Camden.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's we'll try to delve into that as much as we can. And so part of the genesis of this particular discussion is so many people come to St. Joe's, and of course they admire the beauty and the history, what have you. But one of the things that their eyes almost immediately get drawn to is the collection of relics that exists on our altar rail. And you have kind of the story of how this relic collection came to be. So maybe if you could just kind of talk about that a little bit.
The relics were donated by my mother, Nada Barolin. They were given to Monsignor Buccia. She was very close friends with him when he was a priest at St. Joe's. And then when he came back as a Monsignor, he became a pastor there. And that relationship continued. The relics were, I hate to use the word collected because they're not antiques. I think my uncle, Reverend Anthony Cecich, was more of a caretaker. He was a Roman Catholic priest who acquired them in the 50s and the 60s because of the various places that he traveled around the world. And the reason he did that was he attended a very special seminary in Rome called Propaganda Fide. It was a seminary that was created by Pope Urban VIII in the 16th century, 17th century, for the sole purpose of spreading Catholicism around the world. So when my uncle was a seminarian there and eventually became ordained, he got to meet a lot of other fellow seminarians and future priests that came from all the corners of the earth. I'm talking Europe, Asia, New Zealand, the Pacific. So he would go and visit these priests. And I don't know if they had some sort of a barter agreement or whatever, but he always managed to come back with either an ornate vestment that was made at that parish, or he would come back with a relic. And he stored these relics in these barrister cases in the rectory, where he also met Monsignor Buccia. They were priests together at the same rectory for many years and became very close friends. And then when he retired, he moved in with my mother for a short time and brought the relics with him, and they were stored. And after his passing, my mother gave them to Monsignor Buccia. And Monsignor Buccia took the relics and displayed them in the rectory. And then after his death, Father Pavel
Krzyzewicz, yeah.
He had an idea, and he hired a craftsman in Poland, created these unique display cases that were all glass and backlit, and devised a way to mount them on the altar rail. I found out about this, so I came down there and I was blown away. Such a nice tribute to see them laid out like that. I was used to seeing them all cluttered in these little shelves. So my brothers and I came down and we took some pictures, and it was nice to see them finally get out and seen by them. Immediately it hit me, what a draw this is for St. Joseph's. I know that they were using them for confirmation, and what a neat way to be able to pick your saint. But I thought that this would be great for All Saints Day and for holidays. I actually tried to pitch a story to the Star Herald. I got a little bit of wiggle room, but there were no takers. So maybe this podcast will put some pressure on an editor at the Star Herald to do a story.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. We'll see. And so your uncle, this was Father Anthony.
Father Anthony Cecich.
Anthony Cecich.
Routinely called him, they used to call him Dun Tony.
Okay, Dun
Dun
Tony.
meaning father.
Okay.
Or mafia head.
But he had an interesting kind of story of how he came to the U.S., right? So
yes. In fact, that his story ties in very closely with mine. My mother was a sacristan who worked for my uncle when he was it's not a bishop, but there was a title that escapes me at the moment, but he kind of took care of the entire island of Grohota and Sholta in Croatia. I don't know if they were fascist or they came in and they just basically said in no uncertain terms, you got 24 hours to get out of Dodge, or we're going to start to execute everybody. And my uncle ran to the church and stood by the church and refused to leave. And they were going to shoot him. And at that time, it was Cardinal Stepanek, but he was an archbishop at the time. He ordered him with reassignment to take over a refugee camp, become the chaplain for a refugee camp in Cairo, Egypt. And so my mother and my uncle left the island with a lot of other relatives and friends and went to, it was at El Arish in Egypt. At the same time, my father, who was from Istria or Trieste when it belonged to Croatia, was in the army stationed out there. And he would go to the Sunday mass that my uncle would say for the entire refugee camp. And that's where he met my mother. And they were married there in Egypt, and I was born in Egypt. And when I was about a year and 6 months old, something like that, we came to the United States and we landed in Camden.
Now, were those stories, would he talk about it, Father Anthony?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It wasn't like something that he kind of didn't want to talk about the whole.
And my mother talked about it. I mean, she described some of the horrors of the escape, and actually, I used it in her eulogy. She said we grabbed whatever we could do food wise, and we grabbed water and we grabbed oil. And I said, well, what was the oil for? And she said, for the lamps. And then it dawned on me that they didn't have flashlights. They didn't,
Yeah.
they didn't have high beams. If they wanted light, they had to make it. And she said, we were going through wooded areas and quagmires where the donkeys wouldn't go. And then they came to the docks and there were boats waiting, and they hopped on the boats. I think originally her boat was supposed to go to Italy, but it went the wrong way or something turned it around, and it ended up going to a free port in Egypt, in Suez.
Yeah, I mean, it's being Polish. It's all our history. It seems our modern history is so thick with all these stories from World War II and what people went through. And then, but sometimes they would want to talk about it, but most of the time they didn't. That's why I was kind of curious. Like it's like the trauma of it sometimes can be so overwhelming.
Yeah, I heard it more from my mother when she was older and had kind of settled into herself and resolved herself. But yeah, all those nations. In fact, I feel it today when I think about the numbers of people that have been displaced in Syria, or even, I mean, we forget that just 3 years ago, we were horrified that 2.5 million Ukrainians went over into Poland. And Poland didn't have a good time during World War II. They had to clear out. So it was tough. Like everybody was displaced. We all, in fact, I think next to St. Joe's was an Italian neighborhood, and we used to go get mighty good bakery products and stuff like that. So, yeah. So there was they all experienced the same tragedy, and they all understood the same heritage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's something to that when you have that shared pain. And kind of going off of that a little bit. So, you said that you kind of grew up in Camden at St. Joe's, and your uncle would serve there from time to time. He was never officially stationed at St. Joe's,
but because he was a very vital and ever-present part of our lives. He would come over on Sundays, and my mother would cook something. He was a very good cook himself. They would cook up some meals. There was always something happening with the family, with either the brothers or my mother or my father in the church. My dad was a member of the Knights of Columbus. My uncle was a member of the Knights of Columbus. So there was always something happening at St. Joe's. He was very good friends with Monsignor Strensky because of his different assignments throughout the diocese. He had met a lot of the priests and were like Monsignor Bucha when they were priests together at, I think, Our Lady Star of the City. They became very good friends. So my uncle loved the feel of St. Joe's. He used to say that it reminded him of the churches in Rome and some of the churches that he visited, even on the Byzantine side of the church, when he would visit some of his friends who became priests. And he just loved the architecture and the size of the church. He was an excellent singer and would have standing room only high masses. So a lot of times when he would get invited, he would either be a deacon at the mass or he would be a principal at the mass at St. Joe's when they had their high masses. And this is, of course, when before the rite changed and the altar was still facing away from the church. So it was a kind of a different time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that kind of piques my interest too about your family's involvement with St. Joe's and your uncles is that St. Joe's was established as kind of this Polish parish, but there were people from different backgrounds that were there. And I kind of wonder, how did that sort of work? Was it just because it was geographically closest, or what was it about St. Joe's that kind of brought you guys there?
I don't know what went into. I know when we moved right into 9th Street in Camden, 9th and Atlantic Avenue. The first thing my parents did when they came to Camden was join the PACC. And they both, they had a really excellent program there for citizenship and learning English. Now, my dad was a little bit more facile with language. He could speak several languages: French, Italian, English, Croatian, and I think from his 4 years in Libya and in Suez, he probably picked up some good Arabic tongues. But that's where I think they got the connection with the whole community, because this was a pathway to citizenship and also to learn the language and become part of the community. I don't even know if PACC is still running, but used to be right there.
It is still around. Yeah, it's not in Camden anymore, but they're still around. But I don't think they're doing a lot of citizenship work anymore.
But I remember going to a lot of events and weddings and parties there at the hall. At the same time, there was, not too far away on Broadway in Camden, was a Croatian fraternal union.
Okay.
So since we are Croatians, that whole community, in fact, I was surprised how many people from my mother's island actually lived in that part of Camden. They attended Sacred Heart because it was technically on the other side of a railroad track.
Right, yeah. The other side of 676 today, right?
What I found too is that I've met a lot of friends over the years, or made a lot of friends over the years, with people who lived on the other side of Manifan Avenue, going away from St. Joe's. And I didn't go to St. Joe's High School, so I didn't get to know some of them. But now I'm realizing it was a completely different network of people.
Yeah, once you cross the border, I guess it changed a little. So I guess talk a little bit of maybe some of those memories that you have when you were just growing up there. I mean, we had a podcast in March about St. Joe's, so some of those were but so can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Well, I thought about that the other day. What was it about St. Joe's that was different? And the one thing that it's not the most important, but it's the one that if I had a photographic memory, it's still there and it hasn't tarnished at all. I used to serve Mass for the nuns. It was a thrill and it was also scary because you're always afraid of the nuns. And the Mass was, I think, either at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. I lived maybe 4 or 5 blocks away. And I would get up, and in those days I had long black hair, and I would just wet it and sweep it back and run from my house, because it was cold, to the convent. And one time I actually thought my hair was frozen. And I would knock on the door. If you were late, your life was over. So that I would open the door. No words were spoken. You didn't make any noise. I walked in, and Monsignor Stransky always said the Mass for the nuns. But that was one of the things that always sticks in my mind. The other one is across the street from St. Joe's Church was a soda fountain place called Waltz. And that's where we would play box ball or stick ball. And then on the church steps, we would spend summer evenings harmonizing. And sometimes the priest would come over and sing with us, sometimes people from the choir. It was a really exciting time. And one thing I tell my wife, when I was a kid, at around 12 o'clock or 12:30 in the afternoon, no matter where you were, your mother didn't have to worry about you, and somebody's mother always fed you. If something happened to you, the network of communication from backyard to backyard they didn't need cell phones. Because I remember one time I was playing with a friend of mine, right? Maybe I forget the name of the street, but it was about 4 or 5 blocks over. And I was sitting on his bike, and he wanted me to get off his bike. And I wouldn't get off his bike. And he picked up a milk bottle. In those days, they were made of glass. And he threw it at me. And I had all this blood running down my face. And all of a sudden, my mother comes running up. She goes, "I heard you got hit." So somehow it made it. So.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's scary in a way. Almost you get away with that.
And actually, he lived right behind West Jersey Hospital, so the emergency room was right there. But they managed to patch me up, and it wasn't a serious thing. It was more scary than it was.
Yeah. Oh man, that's great. So let's talk a little bit more about the relics.
Okay.
Like you said, it's kind of this object of fascination for people who come and see them. Actually, we had a tour on Friday of kids from Gloucester Catholic, and one of them said to me, "Like, oh, that Jesus thing over there is really cool." And I said, "Well, there's a lot of Jesus things. You want to be a little more specific?" And he was talking about the relic of the true cross that's there. It was one of the ones that your uncle had. So, I mean, why do you think he I mean, you said that when he would go to places, he would get these. Why do you think relics? Was this something that he specifically wanted, or
Well, and my answer to that would be not why as much as how he did it. And I mentioned it earlier that I think when people venerate or acquire relics, there's several reasons. First of all, it is a physical connection to something very spiritual. Most Catholics, and maybe most people don't even know it, but according to canon law, every altar is required to have a Class A relic of a saint. And a Class A relic is a piece of the body or a drop of blood. Not something that he touched, but something that was part of the relic. And that goes back to Emperor Charlemagne, when he was first organizing the Roman Catholic, I guess they call it Roman Catholic Empire.
Holy Roman Empire.
Holy Roman Empire. He was building churches in different cities. And he started buying relics of saints that were martyrs. Most of the saints in those days were martyrs. And whenever money is attached to something, the creeps come out.
Mm-hmm.
And people started going and digging up bodies and pointing them off as relics. According to canon law now, you cannot sell a relic. There is some question about whether you can even own a relic in a private home. I tried to read canon law. I think regular law is a lot easier to interpret.
You're probably right.
But they did put the kibosh on selling it. You can't sell it. I don't know whether when people were selling them on eBay. So I don't know where the value was, but that has all been stopped. That is against the law. But I think that there is a little extra devotion you get out of it. There is a special connection. I think my uncle felt that he was preserving things. He was bringing stuff back from around the world into one place. What I don't understand is why whether he even had a chance to do anything with it. Unfortunately, in the middle of his priestly years, he came down with Parkinson's. in the days when they didn't have any kind of good treatments for it. So he was barely able to function as a priest and do services. I don't know if he had any intentions to take them anyplace else. I didn't talk a lot about them with him. I did more than my mom. But when I went to visit him at, like, let's say, St. James Parish in Atlantic City or in Ventnor, he had the corner apartment in the rectory, and he had them all along the wall, so you could walk by and you go, "Oh, Saint Ignatius Loyola." It was kind of neat. It would have been even neater, but I don't know whether they would have put him or what his intention was before he got sick and had to focus on other things.
Yeah, it's I think it's fascinating looking at the history of relics in the church, and because it's one of these things that again it kind of got abused at times. Then you have, like, what was it, the Venetian merchants who essentially stole Saint Mark for their cathedral. So it does, like you said, it kind of, once there's money involved, but to rediscover that spiritual sense. And I was thinking about this when I was giving this tour on Friday to the kids from Gloucester Catholic. I was like, how many of you went to the Eagles parade? And I was like, did you get an autograph? Did you catch a football? They were throwing them out. Like what did you do with that football? Did you, throw it away? No. Well, it's something that it's a connection to some. So if you have a saint who the church has declared is in heaven, which is presumably our goal, right? Why wouldn't you want to have that kind of first class connection?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I did. Both of my sons were. We were fortunate enough to be able to send them to St. Augustine Prep in Richland, and I remember going into the chapel there. As usually after a mass or a service, we usually go over to the candles and offer our prayers for some special reason. And they had a relic there of Saint Augustine of Hippo, and I believe every one of and I think it's a piece of bone. I think every Saint Augustine prep school has one. And I do have to say there was a profound sense of something hit me when I saw that. So I can imagine when people come in. Now, I don't know whether most churches keep things on display because of all the looting that takes place and stuff like that. So I don't know how effective that is, but it does move you. And for this podcast, I have three personal saints that I'm partial to. The one is Saint Anthony of Padua, and as my brother will attest, that was the patron saint of the family. And on a scale of Easter and Christmas, June 13th was a day of celebration for the family. We got together and we had feasts, and we treated it as if it was the holy day of the year. As I said, I only went to grammar school at St. Joe's, but when I went to the seminary after I graduated St. Joseph's Grammar
Was
School.
that St. Charles Seminary?
No, actually, it was Mother Savior, Mater Salvatoris in Blackwood.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
which is now Camden County College.
Yeah, so St. Anthony is actually a very big saint for me as well.
Okay.
And my great grandmother had a special devotion to him, and he's, the saint of lost things.
Right. Absolutely.
But even just it's like you get that sense of presence immediately. Like, even it's, I don't know.
Until I got married, until I met my wife and got married, I used to pray to St. Anthony for a lot of things that I misplaced. She's picked up the slack. The other two saints were Don Bosco, who was a personal saint of my uncle's. He was Saint Don Bosco was an educator and actually started the Salesian order. And when I was studying for the seminary and became a seminarian, one of the saints that I idolized was Dominic Savio, who was a 14-year-old seminarian who got ill and died. But there was just his whole approach to life and his whole approach to his illness I think Pope Pius XII made him a saint. I think there were some miracles associated with him.
And I mean, where they're at St. Joe's now is what's because I remember before they had put them on display, they were that's those same cases in the rectory. And it's kind of sad.
I think the display it still overwhelms me. I just thought that was such a great idea. I mean, the railing is no longer used. I remember years of receiving Holy Communion kneeling there, so it's a beautiful thing, and I would love to see a YouTube feature done on that, and I'd love to see more interest in that particular.
Yeah, I think that's something that we want to pursue.
Just the sheer volume. I think there's only 90 or so are on display.
Right.
And they're all almost Class A. I don't know if more have. I think a few have been added.
I mean, I know we have the St. John Paul II, but
maybe
yeah, that would Father Krishkevich got that.
But I'm not aware of any place. If somebody listening to this podcast can chime in, that you'll see so many different saints in one location in such a auspicious and venerating situation.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the diocese, I don't think there is, but I mean, you could fact check us, I guess, on that. But yeah, it is a nice way of bringing you because it's like St. Joe's has this kind of presence, and it adds to that knowing that okay, this communion of saints, metaphorically or theologically, and then physically,
right? Yeah, and then even if you we took some pictures from the choir loft, but there's because of that area right where the altar rail is, there's a lot of room. It's open. It's a high ceiling. It's really a really nice way to present it. Whoever came up with that idea was brilliant. It was pretty good.
It's funny. It's like the accessibility of saints is something I think that's a little bit far off. So like we're doing a series on. Do you know Walter Chiswick? Do you know him? His story.
I know the name. Why?
So he was he was a Polish American from Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, and he was over in Poland. And when the Russians invaded, he got arrested as a Vatican spy, and was spent 30 years in Russian prison camps, and was written off for dead. He was a Jesuit, and but they realized that he was alive and had this prison exchange. He wrote these 2 books. So we're doing this 4-part series on him starting in September. But we're having a presenter for each of these sessions. And one of them is his niece who lives not far from us. And it's kind of like, I didn't think of saints having relatives. I mean, it just is. It's like, these were people who had brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and parents, and it's like you talk about like Saint Anthony of Padua, who's I remember the dates of his existence, like 1100s or something, right? 1200s, medieval period, essentially. And it's like, well, no, there isn't anybody that's going to have known him personally around, but there are kind of these modern saints that people, and like it's always, I think, trying to get that connection with someone like that is important, or it's like a human need, I guess. Yeah. And the thing too that so again, I don't know if this is in Croatian culture, but you celebrate name days. Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing in Poland. Like it's your birthday isn't really that important, but your name day is.
Right, and that's what St. Anthony was to us.
Right.
The name day, yeah, and like it was we were going to eat well that day, and my uncle had he was a very, very well liked priest, and because he was down at the shore, he was very good friends with the people who owned the fish company, the people who owned the cheesesteak place there, the White House, and he would come home, and if he didn't bring hoagies, he brought flounder or he brought meat from the so there was always something going on. And of course they cooked all their ethnic foods and made stuffed intestines.
I mean, yeah, and I think there's value in recounting stories of priests, like, so, not only your uncle, but the ones that you talked about that would come and kind of sing with you guys. And so to humanize them, I think is a very valuable thing to do. So yeah, I guess, my final question, what part do the relics, do you think, play into people's lives? Like, how are they relevant still today? So if someone comes to St. Joe's, if it just walks off the street, where do you think that relevance might be to them personally?
Well, I mean, I can only speak for myself. I was, having seen them before, I was so awestruck when I saw them, the way they were presented, and backlit and showcased. And I think maybe people will see if they were named after a saint. I know that nominal issue has changed over the years. Some people are named after verbs.
That's true. Yeah.
But I think you feel something, and there's an attachment there. There's a connection, a devotion that perhaps isn't normally there. You had a great example of a signed football. It's just a football, but once it's signed by Jalen Hurts or somebody who just did something famous, it becomes more than that. So
Yeah. I think it does. I think it's all about connection, like reaching for connection with the divine. But
right.
but I think there's also this sense of, we all really, there's so many people I think that are like, oh, I hate people, I want to like fall from the world, but we do have this connection to be together.
Well, it
like
creates a deeper
stories.
it creates a deeper relationship with God and with the people in your community. And there's also, I guess, what we have at St. Joe's now is historical preservation. These relics have been acquired over. Well, some of them are probably. Actually, I don't even know. I'd have to look at some of the paperwork we have. But even though my uncle may have picked them up in 1950, they may be 100 years old. They may be 200 years old. So here's some history that's being preserved and made available for future generations. So there's a lot of different aspects that I think add to the beauty of it and to the benefits that they provide.
Yeah, it is. It's just, I think, that question of identification with, that's why we started doing the Polar Saints, because it's like, there are people like you. Ultimately, we're all called to be saints, really, by the way we live. But there's that sense of someone like me can become a saint, whether it's just because we have the same name or the same ethnic background or the same profession. I think that's kind of what goes into it. I think that the church, kind of in its history and in its wisdom, recognized that, and that was why these people were kind of elevated.
I'm happy I did this podcast because it allowed me to reflect back on things that when I was growing up I either took for granted or I just passed right by them. So it kind of awakened a few things for me as well. So,
well, that's great. I mean,
that's really what you want them to do. I think it could encourage devotion among other parishioners, and that was I think Joe and I, when we were on the altar rail, I said, "Oh, this would be great if they," because I think it's during Holy Week, where at least with our choir, we would go and visit other churches. We would visit 6 or 7 churches, but I thought, what a draw! I mean, I'm thinking again like a marketing man. What a draw for St. Joe's is, come over here. We got the Saints.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's and I could, because there's that. Camden City is seen as this forsaken place, and I think that's unjust a lot of times. Not a lot of times. I think it is unjust, and St. Joe's is still there. It's old, and sometimes we need some work, but we do struggle with trying to keep it viable and keep people coming. And, so I don't think that that's a bad way to phrase it as a marketing.
Right. I remember when I was growing up, it was a thriving metropolis. We would go and get the bus at Manningham Avenue and Everett Street, and you would have to wait or one or two buses because the buses were full and they would take you downtown. This is when Campbell Soup was thriving, RCA, Parker Penn. There was now it's tumbleweeds, and it's only because now I don't feel as bad for Camden because as I do for Detroit, for example. I did a lot of business in Detroit, and I was stunned as to what happened. But when you have big machinery, big industry, and it leaves, it takes a lot with it, and what's left is it's hard to rebuild. But there's a little bit of a light at St. Joe's.
Tony, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Really enjoyed reminiscing about your uncle and his part in St. Joe's and part that the Relics played then and will still play into the future.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this will encourage us all to pray more.
Amen.
We'll complain less.
As we have learned, the relics of the saints enshrined on our altar build on an ancient tradition of the Church. Yet they are also meant to be held up as a reflection of our very selves. In the story of their various lives, we can see the content of our own souls on display and the call that exists to each of us to form our lives in goodness. Throughout the centuries, when certain people are touched by God, they have been declared holy by the Church. It may be somehow appropriate, then, that the glass cases containing the relics in our church are clear. This transparency should help us to recognize the potential in all of us, no matter our past, ethnicity, background, employment, or heritage, to find our own path to sainthood. All the saints honored on our altar were people like us at one time or another. Their enshrined setting, surrounded by the art and architecture soaring above them, like Michelangelo's Dome in Rome, helped to bring the majesty and glory of St. Peter's to our home in Camden. When hearing the stories of refugees of World War II like Father Cecich and his family, and how their often tragic or trying circumstances allowed for better lives for their descendants, I can't help but think about a valuable lesson contained within this history. In an era when the treatment of the poor, refugees, and disadvantaged in our country and around the world seems to be at a low, it is important to remember that our ancestors, those who built our Polish-American communities, were once in the same circumstances, and also how that community, like today, was a haven for Poles and non-Poles alike, just like Father Tony and his family. I believe it is also important to note the model of community involvement and bonding that existed in these neighborhoods. Fellowship and security, concern and charity, all began at home and in their parish family that was their neighborhood. While people became saints for great achievements, it is also enough for us to humbly find our own conversion of heart in seeing the value and dignity of all people. Once such wisdom is found, it often leads us to the actions that bring about our own canonization, if only in the judgment of the people around us. Our Polish saint of the month is Saint Albert Chimielowski, or in Polish, Święty Brat Albert Chimielowski. His feast day is June 17th, and he lived from 1845 to 1916. Born into a noble family in the town of Ekołomia outside of Krakow, Adam, as he was then known, and his siblings were orphaned at a young age. Educated to take over the running of his family's estate, he soon became embroiled in the political challenges of mid-19th century Poland. At the age of 18, he participated in the January Uprising of 1863 against the occupation of his homeland by Russia, and you can hear more about that historical event in our past January episode. Gravely wounded in battle and captured, his leg was amputated without anesthetic. Dramatically escaping his captors, he fled Poland for Western Europe, and during his exile soon discovered an exceptional talent for painting. Offering everything over to God for the cause of Poland's independence, he accepted his suffering and learned to use a wooden prosthetic leg, returning to Poland in his 30s and gaining notoriety for his artistic talents. Albert nonetheless felt an emptiness that even saw him hospitalized for depression. His faith rescued him and led him to recognition of his call to serve the poor. He became a Franciscan in 1887, eventually founding the Albertine Order. In this era, more than a fifth of Krakow's population was impoverished. Albert saw the need to minister to the poor and destitute of all varieties, giving all he had to the care of the sick, elderly, and mentally ill. Passing just 2 years short of witnessing Poland's independence in 1918, his example of humility, strength, and suffering was an inspiration to many, including the young Karol Wojtyła. Like Albert, he too turned his back on a life of artistic talent to embrace a life of service to God. At one point, the future pontiff even wrote a play about St. Albert, and he later oversaw his canonization in 1989. Reflection. How often do the injuries of our youth plague us in old age? A sports injury or trip and fall in our teens can wreak havoc as we grow older, especially when the weather is bad. How often do we curse the cause of our suffering and our youthful self for being so careless? Odds are that few of us are apt to offer our suffering to God the way St. Albert did. Although his injury was on the battlefield and not on the football field, we can see some parallel in turning suffering into a force of reliance on God and for the finding of the good no matter the circumstances. Although St. Albert experienced great pain throughout his life due to his injury, he refused to let it stop him. In turning back on his possible fame and notoriety as an artist, Albert spurned the expectations of someone with such a gift. How often do we hear about wasting our talents during our lifetime? No doubt there were many who thought Albert was wasting his God-given talent for art by giving it all away in service to the poor. And what some may have seen as wasted potential, Albert recognized as a force for good. Although he had a talent to recognize the beauty of the world and translate it into art, he also had a talent to recognize the beauty in the individual person, even those who were suffering and destitute, or are otherwise on the margins of society. This ability enabled him to translate that which many in the world saw as ugly and unpleasant into something most beautiful, that of a person made in the image and likeness of God, and worthy of respect and care. Like any saint, the lessons of St. Albert's life are many. In him we can recognize the desire for peace and freedom in our homeland, the turning of suffering for good, and the recognition to spurn the perceived glories of the world for something greater. However, one of the greatest lessons may be the one we don't recognize right away. The despair of his loneliness and emptiness while experiencing apparent worldly success is one that we may know all too well. Saints are often seen as unapproachable figures, memorialized in statuary and iconography, set on a pedestal too far off to reach. By experiencing the life of a more contemporary saint who is profoundly human, having known pains and suffering both physical and mental, we are offered hope. The same hope that Albert offered to all those around him in the most desperate of circumstances. And as he would put it in his own words, "You must be as good as bread, which for everyone rests on the table, and from which everyone, if hungry, may cut himself a piece for nourishment." Reflection questions. What principles do I serve and hold fast to in my life? Like St. Albert, do I dedicate my suffering to these principles? Perhaps, like St. Albert, we are finding an emptiness in our current life. How might I find a way to seek, find, and rely on God in my work or my lifestyle to fill this emptiness? The world's suffering is all around us, be they the poor, sick, elderly, mentally ill, homeless, immigrant, or refugee. How can I best work for the betterment of the communities in which I live in and worship? If you'd like more information on the lives of the saints whose relics are in our church, you can check out the special section of our Apostle website, and a link to that will be in our show notes. Also, If you missed last month's show and our announcement of our upcoming Father Walter Cecich initiative, With God in Camden, be sure to check it out. You can also now find more information about this exciting program at the website www.withgodincamden.info. As always, we would remind you to like and subscribe to our podcast. And if you enjoy what you hear, please leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. It doesn't take a lot of time, and it does so much for our visibility. Please also check out our Facebook and Instagram pages for updates and more information. You can always drop us a line at pierogideprayer@gmail.com. We love to hear feedback on our episodes, and if you have anything you would especially like to hear in future episodes, please don't hesitate to drop a suggestion. And of course, you can always come visit us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at St. Joseph's Church in Camden. Until next time, salte some pierogi and go sit with a saint. Dziękujemy, thank you, and do usłyszenia.